This weekend, the world, and especially the United States, has been marking the 20th anniversary of the bombing, the terrorist attack that took down the World Trade Center. Yesterday, Father Faulkner McCarthy from Haddington Road, St. Mary's, was here for a wedding, and as he was signing the delegation papers, the permission he needs to perform the wedding here, he asked what the date was, and I said September 11th, and he kind of started and jumped and said, "Oh, that's a date." And then he looked at me and said, "Do you remember where you were?" And it put me in the mind of my parents and their descriptions of Pearl Harbor, because I think everyone, in the States at least, and my sense is, talking to people here, everyone around the world remembers what they were doing, where they were, when they heard about the planes being flown into the buildings. And I had told him that I was running a residence hall at the University of Notre Dame, and I spent many hours frantically looking through the list of names of everyone who lived, all 300 guys who lived in Keenan at the time, trying to make sure that I had found everyone who may have a potential tie to someone who could have been injured either in New York or in Pennsylvania or at the Pentagon. We have been marking this horrific event. But what strikes me most as I look back on it isn't the images of planes flying in buildings or even the towers collapsing. It isn't the sense of the hate and the anger and the lack of humanity that could do such things. It's calling to mind the images of firefighters climbing into those buildings, going into the danger to help others. And it wasn't just firefighters, it was the 4,000 residents of the little island, Gander Island in Newfoundland, who took care of 7,000 stranded airline passengers for the better part of a week, feeding them and taking care of them and giving them what they needed to survive in this terrible time. It was all of those little scenes of goodwill, gestures of hope in the midst of such tragedy. On September 11th, 9 minutes after United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floor, a fellow by the name of Wells Crowther, a 24-year-old equities trader, called his mother Allison from his office up on the 104th floor. Leaving the message, "Mom, this is Wells. I wanted you to know that I'm okay." And that was the last time she ever heard from him. Crowther made his way down to the 78th floor in the sky lobby, where he encountered a group of survivors, some badly burned from where they had been standing when they were waiting to go down because the other tower had already been hit, and they themselves were right on the impact of the second plane strike. So some of them were badly burned, and they were waiting for an elevator to evacuate down even farther. Crowther, carrying a young woman on his back, directed the group to the one intact stairwell that he had found, and the survivors followed him down 17 flights of stairs, where at that level where they met other rescuers, he dropped the woman he was carrying off before heading back upstairs to assist others. He found another group of survivors as he was helping to put out fires and administering first aid, and he directed the second group 17 flights down as well. As the occupants of the tower continued to head down to the street, Crowther returned to the stairs and headed back up to help others. And he was doing so when the South Tower collapsed at 9:59 a.m. When Alison Crowther read an article in the New York Times that mentioned the man in the red bandana, she knew she had found her son. For Years earlier, when he was little and they were getting dressed to go to church, he'd asked his father if he could have a handkerchief for his pocket. And his dad came back with two. A nice one for the front pocket of his suit, and he said, "This one's for show," and a red bandana for his back pocket. He said, "This one's for blow. This is for blowing your nose." And he carried this red bandana, or a red bandana, in his pocket from the time he was little all the way until his death, where he had it worn around his face. He did so to remain in connection with his dad. His dad had been a volunteer fire department. He was a banker himself, but on the volunteer fire department, and Wells assisted his dad from the time he was a little boy, washing the trucks after they came back from a call, himself joining the fire department as a junior member when he was in his teens, and in fact, telling his parents not long before his death that he couldn't consider life sitting at a desk like he was doing. And they found among his papers in the completed but not yet mailed application to join the New York Fire Department. What his mother said, though, and the reason why I tell this one story, to me is the most interesting, in many ways, the most beautiful. She said, "One of my greatest torments was that he would have been trapped in suffering like so many others. And that would have been the ultimate torture for Wells. So that when we found out that he was actually free to make his final decisions about how he was going to behave in the attacks, this was a huge relief. For in their world, their son Wells did what Wells did. He followed who God was calling him to be and turned to help others at their greatest time of need, heedless of what it meant for himself." In our gospel today, we see the crowds beginning to adulate Jesus, referring to him as John the Baptist and Elijah, or a great prophet. And Jesus wanted his disciples to know that there was a different end. But it's important for us to recognize that Jesus did not court death. He wasn't seeking it, he didn't want it. What he did was recognize that death through suffering and execution was the likely response to him being who he felt he was called to be, to him being a faithful follower of his heavenly Father, of him living out the life he thought he was called to do and to be, where he turned and took care of those in greatest need around him. And in doing so, and in the style that he did it, upsetting authority in a way that would lead to his death. It's important for us to recognize as Christians that when we say yes to Christ at our baptism, when we put on the white robe of salvation, we do so knowing that we enter into a life in which we have no promises, that we're not told that there will be no suffering, no hardship in our life. We're told that we have the grace given to us to respond to whatever situation, and we're called to be the living representation of Christ in our world. Individually and collectively, we're called to speak to truth. We're called to be witnesses of forgiveness and vehicles of hope in our world. We're called to preach love in the face of hatred, to be peace in the midst of violence, and to be symbols of hope in God in the face of oppression and apparent hopelessness. We are to be the body, the living manifestation of Christ in our world. It's odd, sad, that this is a week or a summer that we celebrate the end or the apparent end of a 20-year conflict in Afghanistan that started because of this other event we mark this weekend. In some ways, it's the end of a war, but we know that it isn't. We know that there are people who were living in hardship before. There are people who suffered greatly over the last 20 years from the occupation of foreign troops, especially American and European. We know that many people lived their own form of hell as death rained out of the skies on them. And we also know that with the Taliban still in effect, the lives of those in Afghanistan have not been made easier. We must pray for them. We must ask God to be with them as they make their transition in life. But we must always be mindful that in our own lives and in our own hearts, there are going to be times and places where we are called to go beyond what we would otherwise prefer to do, where we're going to have to speak the words of truth and hope in the face of oppression. And as Christians, we must be sure and try and ask for the grace not to shirk the cross when it comes our way, for it is our only hope.